All right, hi guys. So this video is going to go along with your reproduction notes. The note packet itself should look like this on my screen. It is the last 2 pages of our cell division notes. So after this lecture, you should have the entire packet completed and ready for our test. Okay, so we've talked a lot about cells, but the one thing that we haven't talked about is the cells that undergo reproduction. And it's definitely different than all the other cells in our body. So if we quickly just take a second and think about what is reproduction and why is reproduction so important. So we know that reproduction is producing new offspring. It looks different depending on what type of organism it is. And it's so important, right? Because it helps ensure that populations continue to grow. So there's 2 types of reproduction. There's asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Asexual is unique because it produces genetically identical offspring, and sexual reproduction is very unique and important for most organisms because it produces genetically different offspring. For example, you're similar, but you're very genetically different than your parents. So let's start with asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is the production of genetically identical offspring from one single parent. So asexual reproduction is what we see commonly among bacteria, fungus, some plants, and some animals. The great advantages of asexual reproduction is that because it only takes one parent, it's really quick and easy. And again, it only takes one parent. If you think about the time and energy a lot of animals and plants put into reproducing sexually, finding a mate, putting a lot of energy into, making themselves look good, have the brightest colors, singing the song just right, doing the dance just right, finally getting a mate, and so on. Especially you guys, a lot of high schoolers put a lot of time and energy into the way that they look, the way that they talk, the way that you walk, all of those things. And that is a piece of sexual reproduction. So imagine if we were able to reproduce asexually, we would not have to mess with any of that. So asexual reproduction in unicellular organisms. So unicellular, think that these are organisms that are made of just one cell. So the entire organism is just one cell. So these guys actually just simply reproduce through mitotic division, just like we learned a couple days ago. So they really just go through mitosis. We kind of call it a special term. So we call it binary fission if it's actually dividing into new organisms. So binary fission is when one living cell divides into 2 living cells. And keep in mind that with this, these living cells are the organism. That's as big as the organism will ever get. Oh, this is funny. Okay. Asexual reproduction in multicellular organisms, so organisms that have more than one cell, which is most organisms, they can reproduce in a few different ways. So number 1, we can see organisms go through what we call budding, where the parent essentially grows a tiny little replica of itself called a bud, and it'll grow and grow and grow a little bit, and eventually the little bud will just kind of pop off. So it's totally genetically identical, but it's now developed enough that it can, for the most part, kind of thrive and survive by itself. And that's how this organism makes new offspring. Then some can undergo fragmentation, which is when an organism is separated into little pieces of the parent organism, and every little fragment can slowly develop into its own adult organism. An example of that is flatworms, just like in the picture represented here. So this is a type of flatworm that can physically pinch themselves into pieces, and then each piece will eventually become its own new flatworm. And this is a lab that I've done sometimes towards the end of the year, like after the air test. I'll order these little guys They're pretty tiny, but big enough that you guys can kind of handle them. So you can like take a little flatworm, take a razor blade and kind of cut it into some chunks, and then we can watch it over, usually within a couple weeks. The little fragments have actually developed into individual flatworms. And then vegetative reproduction. So this occurs with plants, and basically it's when new plants can grow from like pieces of the original plant. It may be the stem, it may be a piece of the root, it may be just the leaf. Examples of this are potatoes, spider plants, or common house plant you guys might have at home or a family member. Philodendron, I thought I had one. Oh, I think it died. Oh, I have a philodendron here. So this is actually an example. You guys might have these at home too. A common house plant. It's just philodendron. And literally what I did, I don't know, sometime in the fall, because my sister gave me some. It started as literally just a leaf. And now you can see it has a pretty long root system. And so this little guy just started as the leaf, and now it's beginning to grow into a complete plant. Okay, so that was asexual reproduction, where the offspring are genetically identical. Now we're going to focus on most of the organisms that reproduce sexually. And remember, the key here is that it produces genetically different offspring, which really in the scheme of evolution is really important. So it's really important that we're able to have genetically different offspring. These are with sexual reproduction, the offspring are formed from the fusion of special cells. So we have special reproductive cells that we haven't talked about yet, that each parent produces differently. And we'll also take a look at that. So sexual reproduction is really common through like most plants and most animals. The advantage of this, again, is just producing genetic variation. And we call this process or this cycle meiosis. So it's going to be a little bit different than mitosis. So mitosis is the division of the cells in all of our body except our sex cells. So with meiosis today, we're going to actually see how our sperm and egg are produced. So there we go. Meiosis is the process in which sex cells are produced. Our sex cells are oftentimes called gametes. You might even see that thrown at you on the air test. So our sex cells are gametes, and our gametes are egg and sperm. So we know that females produce eggs and males produce sperm cells. Okay, so meiosis sounds similar, but it's different than mitosis in just a few different ways. So listen up. With meiosis, we actually have cell division that occurs twice. So we'll see these cells go through this kind of a division process twice. The resulting daughter cells, so the new cells at the end of meiosis, contain half the number of chromosomes as the original cell. And that is key, you guys, because we want our gametes to have half the chromosomes, right? So each individual is going to give half the chromosomes to their offspring. You got half of your genetics from mom and the other half from dad. That's because their sex cells went through meiosis and the chromosome number was divided in half. And sometimes because of that, sometimes like in your textbook or in other readings, you'll hear meiosis actually referred to as reduction division, because essentially one of the most important things with meiosis is that it does reduce the number of chromosomes to half. So when we look at the big picture with meiosis, remember I said that it happens twice. And so we call it meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. Easy enough. So we start with the cell. That cell goes through meiosis. That results in 2 cells. And then each of those cells goes through meiosis 2, which in each cell results in 2 new cells. So you can see at the end of meiosis, we have 4 cells total. Okay. We're going to get to these terms, but basically notice that we are going to be tracking what's called diploid cells and haploid cells throughout the process. So let's look closer at meiosis 1. Meiosis 1 is really basically mitosis. So here's what's happened. Imagine this cell, the cell that starts it all. We start with one cell. This cell has gone through interphase, and in the S phase, the chromosomes have been replicated. Okay, so in humans, that means that instead of 46, it's going to have 92 chromosomes, just like we saw with mitosis. So this cell now has double the chromosomes, so it has 92. It's going to go through basically mitosis. It's going to go through prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And at the end of cytokinesis, it ends up with 2 daughter cells, and they're each going to have a complete set of DNA. Okay, so they'll both now have 46 chromosomes. Those cells, though, immediately go into, they shift down here and immediately go into meiosis 2. Meiosis 2 now does not allow the chromosomes to replicate. So listen here. Each cell now has 46 chromosomes going in, right? So we have 46 here and 46 here. And it goes directly into meiosis 2. No replication occurs. Now, here's where we're going to see the division or the reduction of chromosomes, you guys. So one cell with 46 here is going to go through the phases. And these phases, again, look basically like mitosis. So it's going to go through a prophase, a metaphase, an anaphase, a telophase, and a cytokinesis. And so this time what's happened genetically, you guys, is the nucleus that had 46 chromosomes now just gets split in half. That's where we get the reduction. So again, we start with 46. It goes through the process, divides the chromosomes in half. 46 divided in half is 23. So this cell now has 2 daughter cells. Each now have 23 chromosomes. And this cell started with 46, now makes 2 new daughter cells, each with 23 chromosomes. So you can see the end result of meiosis are 4 cells, and they each have 23 chromosomes. If you need to pause and go back and listen to the beginning, where we started with 92 chromosomes up here with meiosis 1, then do that. So we start with 92 here, divides into 46 and 46. They go directly into meiosis 2. And so then we have 46 divided by 2, which gives each new sex cell now only 23 chromosomes. So let's rehash the results of meiosis. So we end up with 4 daughter cells. Each daughter cell is what we call haploid, which has half of the chromosomes. We'll get to that again in just a second. And all these daughter cells are genetically different. We'll see why in just a second. And that is the key with meiosis. So the number one thing with meiosis is that the number of chromosomes need to be divided in half, and they need to be genetically different, which we did not see with mitosis. So the diploid haploid term. So diploid di means 2. So diploid cells in our body have 2 copies of each chromosomes, which includes, so like all of our cells are diploid except our sex cells. So human cells have 46 chromosomes. So the diploid number for humans is 46. like almost all of our cells have 46, right? And remember that of our 46, we got 23 from mom and 23 from dad. Our haploid cells contain only one copy of each chromosome. So I think haploid has half the chromosomes. So the only haploid cells in our body are our sex cells, so our sperm and our egg. And our human sex cells have only 23 chromosomes. Remember, that's perfect because during fertilization, which we'll see in a sec, we want our two sex cells to join and have a total of 46. Okay, so the second piece of meiosis was creating genetically different offspring, which is super important. And that is done by the process called crossing over. So crossing over only occurs with meiosis, never, ever, 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 ever in mitosis. So in meiosis, our chromosomes undergo this process called crossing over, which is when pieces of our chromosomes are exchanged, kind of swapped. Oh, sorry. Remember, the magic of this is that it creates genetically different or more diverse sperm and egg. So what actually happens during late prophase, metaphase, when our chromosomes are kind of jumbling together and getting organized, you guys listen up. Chromosomes are the matching chromosomes. So let's say chromosome number 2 and chromosome number 2 are going to find each other, like in this diagram. And they're literally going to kind of twist around each other, like you can kind of see here in the middle picture. They're going to kind of twist together and actually swap chunks of the chromosome. So they're swapping chunks of DNA. What that means is, at the end, when we end up with our daughter cells, there is a new and different DNA combination in every single daughter cell that each of us make. Every single sperm is literally genetically different than any other sperm made by that individual. Every single egg is genetically different than an egg made by that same individual. So every single gamete is genetically different, all thanks to crossing over, which is fascinating. So again, here's just a good diagram of crossing over. So again, we have two chromosomes. They're going to kind of come meet up together. They're going to twist. I like this diagram because it shows that it happens in multiple places. So oftentimes it happens in multiple places. You can see here these chromosomes swapped up here as well as down here, and that's really typical. So and it will never, ever, ever happen the same again. Okay, so now let's kind of take a closer look at the actual process of producing sperm and egg. So spermatogenesis is the process of making sperm. Spermatogenesis. Spermatogenesis occurs in the male testes. So once an individual becomes sexually mature, their bodies begin to make sperm in the testes. For every original cell that undergoes meiosis here in the testes, we end up with 4 viable sperm. So in the picture here, I like that it starts with 1 cell and it goes through the process, and you can see the end result here, you guys, is 4 sperm, and that's important. So notice that. With spermatogenesis, we end up with 4 viable sperm. Once men become sexually mature, they produce about that many sperm per day. Per day. That's a lot. No offense to anyone, but I always say that sperm are really just a dime a dozen, because males produce that many viable sperm every single day. What I mean by that is, let me talk about this couple that I know in real life, okay? So this couple, they got married, decided to have kids. They tried to get pregnant for a very, very, very long time, like many months, and they became very distraught, very sad. So they eventually went to a fertility clinic, I guess. And the first thing that fertility specialist asked them as they sat in this meeting was like lots of questions about like their diet and their daily life and exercise and stuff. And they both sat there and told the doctor, like, you know what, we eat really healthy. We don't drink much alcohol. We don't ever smoke anything. We're physically active. And the doctor said, okay, well, tell me what does exercise look like for you guys? And the woman said, oh, I run X amount of days, da, 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 da. Male said, oh, I ride like 100 miles every so often, or whatever, right? A huge road biker. And the doctor said, that's it. He said, I want you to stop riding a bicycle for give it a week. Let your testes kind of repair themselves and really build up some healthy sperm, and then we'll take a sperm sample. And so what I'm telling you is the doctor knew that riding a bike can damage the sperm present in the testes at the time. But you know what? Honestly, it's not really that big of a deal because these males are producing sperm every single day. We also now know, not to get off on another tangent, but we know that males like sitting in a hot tub, right? Like a really hot water can also decrease the number of sperm that survive in the testes. So that can, decrease the number of sperm present. So spermatogenesis is different in this way, that males can produce a large amount of sperm every single day. Again, that's very different than what we're going to see with females. And one last time, remember that one process through spermatogenesis starts with one cell and ends up with 4 viable sperm. Okay, so let's flip, and now let's look at the production of eggs. So the production of egg cells is called oogenesis. And oogenesis occurs in the ovaries before females are born, and then it's done. So I am telling you, that means that every female walking around this planet, every egg she'll ever have in her life was produced in utero before she was born. So that's the problem that we see with fertility issues, is that, if females are born with fewer eggs, actually there's lots of issues that females can be born with their egg cells. They oftentimes don't even know until they're trying to get pregnant and they come across issues getting pregnant. But there's really not much to be done, truthfully. If a female is born with no eggs or very few eggs, there is not much that doctor can do. So because the eggs are all produced before a female is born. Sorry, one little tangent is this is a good example of why even it's really important for females to always be protected from X-rays. So X-rays have been known to cause issues in sex cells like eggs present in the female's fallopian tubes or ovaries. And then once the damage is done, it's done, right? They can't just produce more throughout the next week like we saw with spermatogenesis. And here's the second major difference in oogenesis. One original cell goes through the process and does make 4 cells, okay? But you guys, 3 of them, if you look at the diagram here, 3 of them are what we call polar bodies, and they're non-viable, okay? They just die off, they get reabsorbed into our bodies, done. So the polar bodies are really just broken down and gone, and we end up with 1 viable egg. 1. Remember with spermatogenesis, we started with 1 cell, ended up with 4 viable sperm. It's totally different with oogenesis. We start with 1 egg, 1 cell, I should say, 1 cell. It goes through the process, meiosis 1, meiosis 2, ends up with 4 cells, but remember 3 of them are goofy. They're really tiny, basically just a clump of DNA, really. get broken down and they're gone, and we end up with one viable egg. And then starting at puberty, so when females become sexually mature, again, she has been carrying those eggs with her entire life. But finally, once she becomes sexually mature, we see one oocyte or one egg cell that's going to be released and mature into what we call an ovum when it's ultimately released every 28 days. And that's what we call the menstrual cycle. So with sexual reproduction, we call fertilization the moment when the gametes join. So fertilization is when the egg meets the sperm. That fertilized egg is what we call a zygote. So the zygote is a single-celled organism resulting from fertilization. So your very first little cell, right at fertilization, when your parents' sperm and egg met each other for the very first time, is what we call a zygote. Now remember from the stem cell notes that it actually doesn't last that long, right? So pretty quickly that one original cell begins to like rapidly go through the cell cycle and create a big cluster of those stem cells. But that first original cell is what we call a zygote. I like this because it reviews the term haploid and diploid. So remember that our sex cells are haploid. So we have a haploid sperm and a haploid egg with half of the chromosomes. And when they meet, we end up with a diploid zygote. And then this kind of puts it all together. So with mitosis from the past week, remember that we saw just one division. We end up with two new daughter cells. They are genetically identical. So remember with mitosis, we're just making body cells. We want them to be identical. I want, as I'm sitting here right now, I want my little skin cells to make identical skin cells, right? We want that to happen. So the number of chromosomes is going to, with mitosis, is going to be the same. Mitosis just happens throughout our lives, mostly for growth and repair. Meiosis, remember, we have two different divisions. So we see the cells going through meiosis 1 and then meiosis 2. We end up with 4 daughter cells. They are not genetically identical, and that is very good, right? So remember, we want our sex cells or our gametes to be genetically different from not only your parents, but also your siblings, right? So if you look at, if any of you have ever had my sisters, Mrs. Newman or Mrs. Merrill, I always use them as an example because usually some people have had them. We have the same parents. So we have a lot of the same DNA. We look really similar. We talk really similar. We have similar interests. We have a lot in common, but we're obviously genetically different, right? So because of crossing over, we got most of the same DNA from both parents, but a little bit different here and there. Now, it's unique to think about my kids. So my twins are identical. That means that within the first number of days, my fertilized egg, and they don't know why, they don't know what causes this, but my fertilized egg split into 2. And so they literally have the same DNA, right? So they come from this same egg, same sperm that joined in my uterus, and then eventually sporadically within the first number of days, split into 2, and then began to just grow into humans. It's crazy. So meiosis, the chromosomes are genetically different. The chromosomes are cut in half, remember. This begins at sexual maturity, or remember with females, it's actually in utero. I should change that. And then the whole purpose of meiosis is for sexual reproduction. Okay, all right, that's it. And remember that you should be totally done with the notes packet. So if you need to go back and listen to lectures, now is the time.